Okay, welcome back to part 4, our final lecture for Europe. We're going to talk about geopolitical framework and then as well as economic and social development in the region. So we've touched on a couple of the topics regarding geopolitics, so just to kind of build on these a little bit more. Again, we've talked about this region being several, with 42 countries, if I'm not mistaken, it was, many small countries in a region that's really not that large geographically speaking. I think one of the things is when we start talking about a lot of the other regions in the world, we see how much this region has greatly impacted, and especially drawing lines and boundaries and colonization, and a lot of the impacts and decisions that Europe had on other regions has what we would call today colonial legacies. And this is not to say that this region, we think, okay, well, if this is the region that was causing a lot of those changes, then this region itself should have largely escaped that. But even that, we can't say. And the geopolitics, especially if we go back to World War I, we talked about nation states and once they were formed, and this was really the place where after the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, these concept of sovereign countries were finally established. But at the same time, we have had two world wars in this last century, which has greatly redrawn the borders. And then subsequently, there has been more conflicts preceding that has again redrawn the borders. A lot of historians would say that World War II actually was inevitable, that after World War I, there were a couple objectives. One was to find homes for displaced people and displaced ethnic groups. And the second was also to actually punish the quote-unquote losers. But that, the punishment, and then followed by, obviously, animosity and feelings of anger, to put it in very nice terms. That, as well as then the subsequent depression that followed in the 30s, just was kind of the fuel and fodder that eventually led to the Second World War. And again, after the Second World War, we saw boundaries change as well. So we saw, as we talked about, we'll literally talk about this concept of an iron curtain that was pretty much just peacefully agreed on for the most part. It was kind of like it was a peace treaty, a truce, where the East would be under communist Soviet influence and rule, and the West would be capitalist or democratic. And then the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990, again, we saw borders changing, new countries forming as well. And ultimately what we've seen is about they're estimating 9 relatively new countries have been formed in this region. I always do that. I have to click. Okay, there we go. So this just kind of shows us how some of these borders have changed over time. I'm not going to ask you to memorize any of this for the exam, but just so you're kind of aware, a lot of times, unless you've specifically studied World War I or World War II, and World War I was 100 years ago. It's not like it was that long ago. So what we did see was we had empires, and these were replaced by nation states. So the empires still were like sovereign nations, sovereign countries, but they became nation states after World War I. So more of what we associate today as being these countries per se, these states. Some of the things that we've seen with that is this concept of irredentism. So, as again, I said that part of the objective of reshaping and redrawing boundaries and borders after World War I was to punish these empires that had lost. By doing that, some groups had been, all of a sudden, a new border is drawn, and now they're no longer in the country that they previously lived in. So this leads to irredentism, which is a policy to reclaim lost lands or those inhabited by the same ethnicity in another state. This is actually something that has plagued the Balkan areas, even throughout today. And then again, this was followed. So you can see 1914 to 1919, 1945, which was the end of the Second World War. So here you can see East Germany versus West Germany. And then we have a modern day 2015. And World War II was followed by an ideological Cold War, so it was a proxy war. We had actually never fought per se. We'll talk about this when we get to the Russian domain a bit more in a couple units. So again, as I mentioned, it was this concept of an iron curtain that basically came down. This included eventually the construction of the Berlin Wall. And the idea was, and a lot of geographic theories actually influenced some of this, but the idea was that Russia, or USSR, the Soviet Union, felt more comfortable, and in many ways it was a comfort for the West too, that there was this buffer zone between the East and the West, between the capitalist and the communist, kind of this no man's land, if you will say, where obviously people lived there, but there wasn't, the specific enemies. The USSR was separated from Western European countries by this buffer zone. And with this, we saw two different groups emerge: the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO, more typically referred to, and then and this is an organization of countries. The United States is part of it to help control, and there's forces that are involved, like armed forces, and to help maintain peace in the North Atlantic area. And then the Warsaw Pact was this union of, you can see that the striped countries the lands that have stripes to them were part of the Warsaw Pact. It wasn't nearly as successful, but it was a similar concept for the Soviet side. So after World War II, we had the Cold War. And we're going to talk about this a lot more again, when we get to the Russian domain. But just to understand a little bit about its impacts in Europe, because it didn't really take effect in Europe. This was between the Soviet Union and the United States. But the Berlin Wall was part of this because it was part of the buffer zone. It was part of the communist side of Europe. The Berlin Wall finally was torn down in 1989. I actually remember when this happened. I remember hearing about it on the news as a kid. And then this was followed by, so the official end per se of the Cold War was the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. And a lot of people would question today whether or not we're at some type of new Cold War. If you listen to the news, primarily with North Korea, with Russia, I can't even tell you really what's going on with Russia. I think we hear Russia. I can't even open up the news without seeing something about Russia, especially with their meddling in, or potential, or alleged, I should say, meddling in U.S. elections, the last presidential election. And then with this, with the thawing, as they're calling it, of the Cold War, the breakup of the Soviet Union, and then the falling of the Berlin Wall, we saw more border changes happening. So a lot of times, again, what we associate as being these very stable, permanent borders, they're really not. The borders have drastically changed throughout Europe over the last hundreds of years, and on multiple occasions. Another area that is a good example was so the Balkans area, this today what we called Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, Kosovo, Macedonia, and Albania. This whole area was clumped together, if I'm not mistaken. And again, these changed. So we had Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, which I think I still love. I think those are great country names: Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia. But anyway, so these countries don't exist anymore. We've seen this process of Balkanization, we call it. So it's a process of small-scale independence movements based on ethnic fault lines. So again, these were territories, these were parts of empires that again were punished and redivided by foreigners, by outsiders into new countries. And ethnic lines are not always clear, especially to outsiders. And how do you go in? And there's lots of different groups and lots of different stakeholders and lots of different sides, and people's objectives aren't always, the best. So in the 1990s, we saw this series of Balkan wars for independence. There was a lot of genocides, again, what we would refer to as ethnic cleansing movements. I have a friend who fled here in the 1990s. She's from Serbia, and she fled to Bosnia and eventually to Hungary. And she actually now today still is studying refugees who are making their way into Hungary. So this is still it's a very conflictive area. And there still is a lot of your book goes into this quite a bit more, but there still is a lot of conflict over, Kosovo, for example, that certain countries still say, well, they still have the objective of regaining this land. And you can see, so this map gives you a breakdown, but you can see, for example, look at Kosovo. So Kosovo has 1.8 million people, and it's talking about its EU potential if it's a candidate or a potential applicant. But the ethnicity of Kosovo, 92% are Albanian, 8% are other. So, Kosovo is still a place where Albania wants to regain it. And you can see this kind of gives you a complexity, understanding the complexity of it, right? 96% are Muslim, 1% are Serbian Orthodox, so Christian, and 2% are Roman Catholic. 95% speak Albanian, 2% speak Serbian, and 2% speak Turkish. Then you go down to Albania, we've got almost 3 million people. 83% are Albanian, 1% are Greek. So there's, I'm assuming that only adds up to 84%. That would be other ethnicities. Montenegro, you go to Montenegro with 0.6 million people, 45% are Montenegrin, 29% are Serbs, 9% are Bosniaks, and 5% are Albanians. So this really gives you this idea of how complex these regions are, right? If you go over to Macedonia, 25% are Albanian. So it's not like you can go and, even then imagine, people move, people don't just stay in the same place. So redrawing these lines is something really complicated. Ethnically speaking, these are very diverse regions. So there is still a lot of conflict in these areas. I'm trying to think here. Serbia is not too much of a surprise. And there was also, I saw this great play, it was probably about 18 years ago now. It's in New York City. And it was actually the first time I'd ever heard about an Albanian genocide. And it was, I believe it was the Muslims killing, I can't remember, I'm sorry, I do apologize, I can't remember if it was, they made it sound the way they presented it, and the play didn't focus, it was more about the recovery and the life thereafter of these two immigrants who had fled, and they talked about their stories of survival and witnessing their families being brutally murdered in front of them, and how much they struggled with life afterwards. But, there's a lot of, it's just a really good example of these genocides, of these ethnic cleansings that we have seen in this region, where even today there's a lot of political tension over whether or not they should be considered genocides. So part of this, so going back to a broader perspective of Europe, we also have this concept of devolution. So devolution means the decentralization of power away from a central authority. So it's very similar to independence movement or a separatism movement. I haven't heard a whole lot in the news in the last several months, but the best examples would be in Europe. We have Scotland. Scotland took a vote a few years ago about, well, they've taken a few votes, but I think the most recent one was a few years ago, trying to decide whether or not, it was a vote, do you want to stay as part of the UK or do you want to separate from the UK? That literally, I think it was like a one question vote. And then Catalonia, which is Barcelona. Most of us might not know that Spain is actually consisting of a few different countries. Or there were countries, I suppose, more different ethnic regions. So you have the, let me think, you've got Basque Country, País Vasco. You've got Catalonia, which is Barcelona, and they actually all do speak different languages in these regions. And then you have Galicia, which they speak Gallego. And there was a time, and again, it was in the 1940s under Franco was the dictator's name, and he made it illegal to even speak your native languages in these regions. So, but these regions are bilingual. There's been a huge resurgence of cultural pride. And so there's Catalonia has had independence vote, and then it was the Spanish government basically said no. They ixnayed it, and it was maybe a year ago, they were talking about this in the news, and they were even arresting women. They had the police being quite brutal. There was images being shown on social media of, elderly women going to try and place their vote, which it was the national government was saying it was an illegal vote. Because it wasn't sanctioned by the national government, but more of like this regional government. And it's rather informal. The national government doesn't want to recognize it. They don't want to lose this region of the country. Scotland is not nearly as violent as that. And so then, as we've seen this, part of this emergence of this concept of devolution, you've also seen these anti-EU parties. So if we're looking at the European Union, Brexit's a good example. So a few years ago now, the UK took a vote about whether or not to invoke Article 50, I think it is, of the European Union, which would be to vote to leave the European Union. So there are a lot more growing, and part of this is nationalism and nationalistic ideologies that we've seen emerging throughout this region. But there is, it's this, unity that has been built, and now people are wanting to, some countries, there's a movement to separate from the EU, as well as separate from a country that this region might be a specific region, such as Catalonia or Scotland, which technically Scotland is an independent country, but it's part of the United Kingdom, to be separate. So economic and social development, kind of sum up this area. This is the birthplace of industrialization and capitalism. So it's got the longest history of development in a progressive, modern day mainstream concept of this. It's gone through this, especially over the last 100 years, it's gone through several periods of economic recovery after depressions and wars and recessions. This region is also very characterized by regional cooperation. That, of course, as I just mentioned with Brexit, is being questioned about whether or not countries want to continue participating. But historically speaking, over the last 100 years, despite wars, there has been a very good regional cooperation, especially that's been quite prosperous for some countries, economically speaking. However, this has also led to unprecedented social as well as economic development. So as we mentioned, this is the home of the Industrial Revolution, which happened about 1650, started in Europe and then started in the UK and England and then spread to mainland Europe. And this is where we saw, I'm not really going to go into this too much, but we basically had cottage industries and different products were produced at a house level, and then this town level, and then goods switched to factories. And it changed everything from the economic and social infrastructure of these countries as well. The ways of life, laws, education, everything was greatly changed by the Industrial Revolution. So this map shows us like a broader perspective of where we've seen older industrialization or older industrial areas, and then the green we see newer industrial areas. Historically speaking, the older industrial areas are located near coal. That's where they make sense, right? Coal was used to fuel the factories for the energy, to produce the energy, and makes sense to put the factories near where your energy source is from. So while it did start in the UK, it wasn't long. I think it was by about 1850, so about 200 years after we saw the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It switched to this Ruhr area, which is here in this area of Germany. And again, this was where major coal fields were located. So a couple of things here regarding quote unquote rebuilding post-war Europe. There were a few different phases. It wasn't just that, boom, the European Union existed. There was different trade deals, economic and commercial treaties and agreements, and basically you would think like with the free trade agreement, CAFTA or NAFTA, for example. And then over time, this eventually emerged into what we saw, the European Union. Even then, we had the European Union, but there were just certain laws. So day we have the euro, for example, what we call the Eurozone, that didn't go into effect, I think it was until about 2002. But so the European Union, if you will, it's kind of like independent states. So as we have here, the United States of America, there is a centralized government. Each country would have its own senators, their own government, their own national government, but then they would also have representatives that belong to the European Union Parliament as well. All the countries are expected to pay in a certain amount of money, and then they receive, so if you will, like pay taxes, and then they receive certain benefits and certain funding that goes back that's distributed based on different needs for the countries. Or it's also, there's this built-in system that was supposed to help give other countries that might not be doing well, Italy, Greece, for example, to give them more economic support or make trading support. Largely speaking, it has been quite successful. And then we've seen expanding membership. So you can see on here the year the countries actually became part of the European Union. There are a couple countries, Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland, are technically not part of the European Union. They do have different types of agreements, like the Schengen Agreement, where you can go and travel from one region to the next, which we talked about, I think it was in part 2. And then you can also see a couple of countries have accepted applicants to the European Union, but they aren't actually officially part of the European Union. Usually they have to have certain things need to change, and then there's some potential, the green ones are potential candidates to the European Union as well. So with Eastern Europe, there is a huge disparity between Eastern and Western Europe. And again, this goes back to think about the Iron Curtain and there being a division. So historically, Eastern Europe is a lot less developed than Western Europe. And primarily this is due to the fact that, and we'll talk about, we're talking about these areas over here, okay, Eastern Europe. And you can see even when they became parts of, we're looking at 2007 for Bulgaria, Romania, Poland 2004, Lithuania 2004, Latvia, Estonia. Some of these, especially those last 3 I mentioned, were previous members of the Soviet Union or countries that didn't exist. And a lot of these countries, as again, I said they were Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. So these are a lot of new countries. 2013, Croatia became a member of the European Union. So the dates that they actually joined the European Union are much later than the Western states. And a big part of this is that, again, going back to the Iron Curtain, and there was, they weren't capitalist. They were part of the Soviet Union to some extent, at least under the economic control of. And then this, since the 1990s, there has been what we could call a chaotic economic transition. So they had most of their linkages, their economic linkages and trade deals would have been with the Soviet Union, which then fell. So they had the loss of a Soviet support. And then they had to reconfigure their markets and figure out how to go from state ownership to more capitalist economies. However, there are changes and they are gradually catching up. So the Eurozone, as I mentioned, we've got the European Union, but we've also got the Eurozone. So the Eurozone is basically countries that use the euro. So it's an economic and monetary union. You can, I believe, be a part of the Eurozone and not be part of the European Union. And some countries you can, I know for sure, be part of the European Union and not be part of the Eurozone. So for example, in the UK, you can't use euro, they still use a British pound. However, this isn't to say that there's not a lot of issues with economic disparity. If you go up and if you've read in the news at all in the last probably at least 6-7 years, Spain has had a lot of issues. Portugal has had a lot of issues. Italy has definitely had a lot of issues. Greece has had a lot of issues. There's been a lot of bailing out. So these countries can take loans from the EU in general, like the IMF, for example, the Inter-Monetary Fund. And yet a lot of these countries have ended up defaulting on their loans for a variety of reasons, for different issues that are going on within the countries. So there is a lot of disparities, economic disparities. Germany usually has one of the strongest economies within the EU. But it has created this bit of a crisis in the Eurozone of what to do, whether or not they should dissolve, whether or not they should stop the euro. As far as I know, there's no immediate plans to make any changes, but there has been a lot of changes in the last couple of years, especially regarding whether or not countries should continue to be bailed out, how, if certain countries should be excluded from the euro because it can contribute to devaluing the euro as well. Okay, so social development in Europe. Generally speaking, gender equity is quite good across the region. However, in Eastern Europe, it's not quite as good. We do see high female workforce participation, but again, in specific regions, but it depends on what kind of roles that women are playing. And today we still are seeing what we'd call complex gender issues in migrant cultures, especially cultures coming in from outside, from immigrant populations, where there's a lot of conflict between their home cultures and these new cultures in the countries. Okay, so just a quick review there for you at the end. Let me know if you have any questions. Have a great week.